My name is Chris Zeller, and I'm with the Post and Courier, and we welcome everyone this morning in our 6th Inside Business Live. How many have y'all been to, how many of y'all is this the first Inside Business Live? All right. I'm assuming you're here because you care about the topic that we're talking about. We've been doing this for about a year and a half. We started off, the whole idea of Inside Business Live is we tackle topics that are important and make a difference to our local businesses and our community. The past topics have included the future of energy, recruiting and retaining talent, education and education reform, which spawned a series of events across the state around our Minimally Adequate series by our projects team, affordable housing, and tourism. And today we're very excited to talk about, I think, an issue that's very important to everyone, which is transportation. I'm here to introduce to you a couple of our people from the newsroom, and we're going to turn it over. The way the format will work is we'll do about 35 plus minutes in questions to our panelists, and we'll reserve the last 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So with that, I'm going to introduce to you David Slade. David Slade, who's a local reporter who focuses on growth issues, and then Robert Baer, who is one of our local news editors. So please welcome David and Robert.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for being here this morning. I'm going to start by asking each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and sort of explain how they fit into the picture of mapping out the future of our transportation, of the way they get around. This obviously, as a local news editor and former reporter, I know that transportation and congestion consistently ranks among one of the top issues, if not the top issue in local politics, and a lot of people have a sort of a say in that and help guide and shape what's going on. You're looking at 3 of them, and let's begin with you, Mike. If you could just talk a little about yourself and what the different hats you wear in this area.
Great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Robert, for doing this. My name is Mike Seekings. I am, at first instance, a Charleston City Council member. I've been on the Charleston City Council for 10 years. Somewhere along that route, I got myself appointed to CARTA, and I am now, and I have been for, I think, the last 5 years, the chairman of the Charleston Area Regional Transportation Authority. I also chair our Traffic and Transportation Committee, and at the risk of doing something I probably shouldn't do, rather than tell you a little bit about me, I have a question for the audience. How many of you in this room in the last 30 days in Charleston, South Carolina, or the region have ridden public transportation? Wow, 3, okay. How many of you in the last 5 years have traveled to a city of more than 1 million people, somewhere in America or somewhere in the world? How many people travel, right? And when you get there, among the first things you do, when I ask people what the first thing they do, they all say, go to the bathroom. But after that, what do you look for? Transportation, how you're getting somewhere, where you're going. And if I were to ask you to write on a piece of paper what 5 things make a good and great city, somewhere in that list you would write transit and public transportation. So from the perspective that I have as chairman of CARTA, we in this region since 1670, when we were founded in Charlestown, we have never had a large-scale transit project. It's hard to find anywhere in the world, from the most wealthy to the most impoverished, that don't have some form of mass transit getting around. So that's sort of the whiteboard that we'll begin with this morning, talking about all the options that are out there, multimodalism, but recognizing that culturally, we expect in other places what we don't demand of ourselves. And so this conversation is not just about mobility, it's about the mindset and the political will to move forward into a time when we will give people options on the mobility side. So that's kind of what I do every single day, is think about that and ask polls and get those kind of answers. And we're going to change that, we're going to shift it, I promise you.
Good morning, all. My name is Jason Crowley. I'm Director of Communities and Transportation for the Coastal Conservation League. Conservation League was founded in 1989 with a mission to protect our natural resources along the coastal plain by working with citizens and local governments in the area on good policy and smart growth measures. We have a focus in particular on how we can grow and manage growth in smart ways, really focusing on traditional neighborhood design. Charleston is internationally known for its urbanism. We were based on an urban grid, and somewhere along the lines in the 20th century, the United States really forgot how to build cities. We started abandoning traditional design techniques that promote walkability, healthy lifestyles, and connectivity, and really started focusing on auto-dominated development, building highways, destroying neighborhoods, sprawling further and further out. And the Conservation League was founded at a time when the city of Charleston in particular was growing geographically, land-wise, but we were losing population. So we were sprawling outwards, but our population was not reflecting the size of the city as a landmass. And so what we were created to do is to work with local communities and governments throughout the coastal plain in particular, to come up with policies and planning tools that help bring people back to the table to work on designing good towns and communities. And so my work at the Conservation League really focuses on that community level activism and planning to focus on these types of town plans, comprehensive planning, transportation planning that brings equity back to our infrastructure, looking at ways to get people out of their cars, onto the streets, bringing all modes of transit, public transit, walkable and bikeable infrastructure, and car transit together through complete street policies. And we work throughout Georgetown, Charleston, and Beaufort County, the Beaufort area, so all along the coastal plain.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay. Maybe? Okay, sorry. I'm Catherine Basha. I am the planning director at the Berkeley Charleston Dorchester Council of Governments, which is a mouthful to say all the time. So we are the regional planning agency, one of 10 in the states, and we work with all 3 counties and the jurisdictions within them to basically address issues of common interest, and one of them being transportation. But we also staff the Charleston Area Transportation Study, which is the metropolitan planning organization for the region. The Metropolitan Planning Organization is the organization that basically is responsible for distributing the allocation of federal funds for transportation that come to us. So we do a lot of planning in terms of deciding how that allocation should occur. We don't receive nearly as much money as we have needs for, so every 5 years or less we do an update of our long-range transportation plan. We just finished the one for the urban area in January of this year, and are working on one for the rural area. But in that case, we basically work with the jurisdictions, the counties, and the larger jurisdictions in identifying what projects they think need to be done in the region as far as transportation. We then work with the public in identifying some more projects. We take those projects in, we do an evaluation of them against state and federal criteria to score them and rank them, and basically put them in priority in terms of how we might put them kind of into our funding program. So our goal, since our funding is so limited compared to the need, is to leverage our funding against the transportation sales tax funding and the state funding that we can get into the region to basically build a very robust multimodal transportation system. So it's not just roads for us. We look at preserving what we have and trying to improve congestion with what we have, and then also by using transit, by improving bike and ped facilities, but then also to look at kind of where we can get the biggest bang for our buck. If that means improving intersections, if that's easier, improving access management along our corridors so they're not as congested. So we kind of prioritize those over new roads, and hopefully can, at least in the next 5 years, make a dent some more.
Thanks for introducing yourselves. There's so much to talk about. I've been writing about growth and development here for a good part of 15 years, and a couple issues keep jumping out, and I'm hoping we can get into some of them. One is that everyone I talk to wonders why we don't have a train. I mean, am I right? Train? Why don't we have a train? And we've watched years of planning studies, and then they eventually decided, we'll have a bus instead. And we'll maybe get to that later. But I think the big challenge in our area kind of bifurcates into two things. We've got all these growing places that haven't quite developed yet, but we know they're going to. All the 10,000 home subdivisions out in Berkeley County where there's still time to plan. But an equally, maybe even more difficult challenge is what do you do with places like Mount Pleasant? Mount Pleasant's pretty much built out. We had 15,000 people here in 1970, now we have 90,000 people. The land is pretty much all developed. There's virtually no public transportation. The streets are jammed, they've widened almost everything they can think of. And when the town came up with a plan to focus on a more walkable, more densely built urban core, the kind of thing Coastal Conservation loves to talk about all the time, the result was that the residents of Mount Pleasant threw out the entire government and went in the opposite direction. So why don't we start with how do you take the places that are already built up and try to fix them? The place where there are houses in the way of every road or transit system you might care to try to build, and when you talk about connectivity, people go, I don't want traffic cutting through my neighborhood. I'm not sure who to pitch that to first, so why don't we start with Catherine, because you went last.
Let's see. So retrofitting in kind of your major transportation corridors is not easy because a lot of times you do have buildings that are already been built there. I think the most difficult thing that we have to explain to people is that density is not a 4-letter word. It actually has 6 or 7 letters. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a matter of how you apply density in areas that will work to support things like a better transit system so that we can move people in various ways, cost efficiently. And then, so I think it's as Mr. Seekings was saying, it's a mindset to try to get people around that. Mount Pleasant growing up as a suburban setting, I think that people move there to be in the suburbs, but recognizing now that there's more people there than what was anticipated. If more people want to move there, that you need to basically look at ways to put that population together in areas so that we can actually support our transportation system so it's more efficient as opposed to sprawling even more.
Sure, I'll jump in on this. This is a very emotional and personal issue for everybody that lives in these communities. It's not unique to Mount Pleasant, it's not unique to Charleston or South Carolina. We are going through a trend that is the pendulum swinging backwards from the middle of the 20th century when people were moving out of the cities. People are now wanting to move back into urban centers. And with that comes the needs of being able to accommodate for growth and mobility. During the 20th century, during the peak of suburban sprawl, we made disconnected communities that relied on cars, and everybody had a 1/4+ acre yard, and that pushed people out. And now to be able to invest in mobility solutions, it really takes a very sensitive touch and approach, and we need to have leadership at the top and community leaders at the grassroots level that are willing to work with people to help educate on the benefits and relieve some of the fears that this won't necessarily destroy your community or your identity, but help introduce ways to show how it can actually be a benefit. You know, there's ways to improve the grid network of roads to identify places where you can do small incremental improvements of connecting a street here or there. That comes with the fear of that will put more cars in our community and therefore cause more danger to children who live there. But you can work on ways to show how a small connection, maybe it is just adding a small interconnection that can demonstrate how you can walk to school now, or something like that. And then adding density in a way that doesn't mean necessarily huge apartment buildings, but looking at ways to put in things like accessory dwelling units behind houses, in-law suites, over garages. That provides the ability for someone who might not be able to afford to buy a house in a place like Mount Pleasant, but could afford to rent an apartment there. That adds density without necessarily changing the character, and looking at opportunities to bring people to the table through more community meetings, neighborhood meetings, to talk through these ideas. One of the challenges in places like Mount Pleasant, though, and other suburban communities around our region are homeowners associations. That changes how you can do things because it's its own sort of sub-level of government. So you can't have a town necessarily go into a private community and say, we're going to do all this, if the homeowner association might own those roads. And that's a
great point. And when we talk about some of the growing areas, I want to circle back to that one. But let me ask Councilman Seekings, because you hear from the people on City Council.
Not just limited to city council, I guess.
Well, not just city.
Regional.
But
communication with political elected officials is a regional sport, I can assure you.
Right. So when ideas come up about let's open up your neighborhood or subdivision so that we'll have more of an internet-connected grid and people can drive through your neighborhood to get somewhere, what kind of response do you hear from people other than we want speed bumps?
Well, so speed humps are something to talk about. I mean, I think that people now in 2019, Charleston and the region, understand that connectivity is a big issue, and that the point you brought up earlier is that, we built our community before we built our transportation network, and so retrofit as triage is a very difficult proposition. And you also asked the question, a lot of people say, why don't you have a train? I sort of have a glass half full personally. Well, thank God we don't have a commuter train, because that's just then. And if we're going to be thinking about the future, you've got to look at what goes on hence. And, I heard you mention rubberizing, some people sort of shook their head to bus. Well, if you think about bus, don't think about just a bus and a bus stop and a shelter. The future of the mobility, not just in this region, but all over the world, is rubberized and flexible so that when communities move and need some things, you can scale it to them and you can bring it to them. So with Low Country Rapid Transit, we will be able to build an integrated transit network that has dedicated lanes, dedicated travel paths that get you to where you want to go quickly, efficiently, safely, predictably, all the things you want, and the place you actually want to go, not on this old chugged method that then is in and stuck forever. So, when you get down to the micro level and you get through communities, they get it. But what they want to do is make sure that travel times, travel distances, and where people are going are short walks, short bikes, short drives to things like park and ride and accessibility and all that. And as we move forward, and I heard it said on this panel a few times, I can't emphasize it enough, as we think about the future. Like in the city of Charleston, we have a planning department and we have a traffic and transportation department. And they are both figuratively and literally spread as far apart as they could possibly be from each other. They should be merged. Traffic and transportation is 100% a function of planning. Why they are not literally have desks on top of each other and are thinking about that in the future is a mystery to me, and we have to change that. Density, the word you hear density all the time, and oh my, density. Density is not a four-letter word. Density clearly is something we have to have if you want accessibility and you want to have communities that are alive and vibrant. And we're not one person, four tires all over the place. We have to have that kind of vision going forward. And as you'll see large-scale transit coming, Low Country Rapid Transit, we're going to go through some corridors that are not currently developed that have some opportunity for zoning. Transportation and zoning are synonymous. So planning, zoning, transportation are all linked. And the last piece of that puzzle, because we're particularly the Low Country, where do we store excess water in the Low Country? When it rains, when it floods, when we have a storm, where do we store our water? In our roads. So we have that added challenge and component, and it is true. That's where we store water. So we shut down our transportation grid 10, 15, 20 days a year through rain, storms, now these clear water tides. So All of those are challenges that we have to think forward, recognizing that we have to put things together, infrastructure politically and infrastructure physically. So I'm not sure I answered you directly, but yeah, speed bumps, people like speed bumps. Until, by the way, if you live in a community that is asking for a speed bump, just listen to the cars coming down your street. When they hit a pothole, listen to the sounds they make, and I assure you, you will not want a speed hump right in front of your house. Everyone wants them in the street, no one wants them in front of their house.
A few years ago, I was fortunate enough to interview a planner at the State Department of Transportation, and it was for a story about how the state was able to use the smartphones that we all have to track actually congestion and the pace of traffic, because they send signals that are recorded, and the state now, planners now have ways of mapping congestion, areas where cars just don't move or get stuck in ways that weren't possible before. And one of the more fascinating things I learned was that when this area spent millions and millions of dollars to add a little bit of extra lanes to I-26 between 526 and Remount and Aviation Road, making that area a little wider, a little more passable, there was a notable decrease in congestion for about a year. And after that, people realized, hey, this has been improved. I'll drive that way instead of Rivers Avenue. And so literally the benefit of that multi-million-dollar significant public expense from a congestion relief standpoint was about a year. So my question to you is highway congestion as we know it actually solvable? Or is it, one of my favorite quotes along this lines came from a traffic engineer, Walter Kulash, who would talk about the concept of induced demand. You know, if you build it, they will come, they will drive on it. And he said, trying to solve highway congestion by adding lanes is like trying to solve your overeating problem by buying bigger pants.
So I'll jump in really quickly and say, no, highway congestion is not solvable. Highways, by definition, are meant to be congested. They're places for lots of cars to move quickly around. And if you get in a plane and you fly over a highway, you see all the reasons why highways are congested. It's inefficient, there's lots of room between cars, there's lots of cars going there. So we have to give people options, right? If you get in a traffic jam by your choice, that's one thing. But if you give people options, not by choice, by demand, then you're in a better place. So typical conversation on any Friday afternoon in my office is phone rings, friend, colleague, constituent, someone's grumpy, gets on the phone and says, hey Mike, you got 10 minutes, I got some free time, I'm in a traffic jam. Like, well great, happy to talk to you, but we're starting this conversation out with the following proposition. You're not in a traffic jam, you are the traffic jam, right? That's kind of how it works. If you're one car, four tires in a traffic jam, the retort from someone who's really smart on the other side is, aha, right, but I got you because you haven't given me any options. The only way in this region for me to get around is in my car. So options are the thing. If we give you options that are legitimate, efficient options in transit that get you from where you want to go to where you want to be, whether it be transit-oriented dense development, whether it be low-country rapid transit, intermodalism, modal-modalism, all of those things, we have to give you those options, and then you can decide whether or not you want to be part of that large-scale, traffic-moving, ultimate traffic jam. And there's so many examples, not just around the country, but around the world. Houston now has a 24-lane highway. 24 lanes, 12 in each direction. It's got a traffic jam on it. I predict you, if you go on GPS and look at it right now, it's jammed. So we're never, ever, ever going to pave our way out of our challenges. And before I forget, I made a note. Next month, in this region, for the first time, we are going to have a scheduled commuter ferry service from Daniel Island to downtown Charleston. First time ever. We're going to use our water to get people around. We need to use those resources for mobility, and it's going to work. So, got to start somewhere, right? So
let me jump in and ask about the resources, because almost everyone on the panel has said, roads aren't the solution. Roads, are not necessarily the thing you want to spend your money on. I know these plans go through BCD-COG, and at some point someone decides, well, in fact, they are the thing to spend the money on, because we have $1.6 billion right now already budgeted for widening 526 from West Ashley to Mount Pleasant. And that price is going to grow because they haven't figured out the part with the bridges. And then another, what, 800 million to extend 526. So we're getting close in on a third of South Carolina's annual budget, the state's annual budget, just for I-526. So someone's deciding, yes, in fact, this this is a good use of money. What do you say, Catherine? How do we get there? Why doesn't that money go to the transit system?
Well, Mark Clark, completion aside, the 526 and the I-26 projects are funded through a different pot of money, not the pot of money that we necessarily get through our office and program. Interstate funding goes directly to the state, and the state makes those decisions. But I-26 corridor, one of the study that they're doing right now, working on the congestion there, has been looking at what are the causes of congestion there. And the 526 project started back, I think, in 2011 when they started to look at how that corridor could be expanded. But in both cases, where they're looking at things like managed lanes, so when they add the additional lanes to 526, or if they do add additional lanes to I-26, looking at whether those could be HOV or HOT lanes to kind of control the congestion along those. On I-26 corridor, what they're finding is that most of the congestion in the morning, and you guys probably hear this on the radio, is because somebody ran into the back end of somebody else. So I don't know, we were joking the other day that maybe all of us adults need to go take driver's ed every 5 years just as a reminder about courteous driving. But looking at that, a lot of that happens right where the merges are, people coming onto the interstate from the ramp. So they're looking at things like ramp metering to kind of control that merging movement to try and reduce the accidents that happen that then cause the congestion. So we're looking not only at investing in the interstates with additional lanes on 526, but mostly looking at some small incremental improvements that could just basically help how we flow and reduce the congestion that way.
I would say one of the biggest reasons why we put more money towards our roads than our transit system is political will. We don't have leadership at the local, state, and federal levels that wants to prioritize infrastructure for mass transit. We don't have people really with power in their hands championing dollars going towards bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure at a rate that actually will improve the ability to invest in this. And it's not, again, just here in Charleston, it's everywhere. New York City, for example, has seen more deaths this summer of bicyclists than they have in the last 2 years combined. So this is something that we are dealing with across the nation, but it is because we are moving back to the urban centers. Their population is exploding. We have to start investing in infrastructure that gets people out of their cars. You can get, 20 cars, on the road for the same length of a bus that could fit 80 people. So by working together, as Councilman Seeking said, with transit and planning our land use so that you can have more density near the transit corridors. Rivers Avenue is a perfect example. We're planning low country rapid transit from Somerville to downtown Charleston, which will primarily go down Rivers Avenue. We need the leadership in the municipalities where that corridor goes to start changing the land use patterns there, changing the zoning in order to encourage more transit-oriented development, putting density in places where we currently have primarily underutilized commercial properties.
Let me jump in on that one, because that segues right into what are we doing with the areas that are growing fast right now to keep them from ending up being the problems that we're already seeing in places like Mount Pleasant and James Island, where it's almost too late to change anything without great effort and consternation. I mean, you've got, you're talking about how people like to live in urban areas now, and that's true, but But where we're seeing the big growth is not the heart of the city. We're seeing 9,000 homes being built in the Kahnaway Peninsula. We're seeing 4 subdivisions that together will have the population of Mount Pleasant
Yeah.
being built out by Somerville. That's Carnes Crossroads next and Cane Bay and whatever they're calling the Bearcat track next to that. And then out in Dorchester, I think it's the Summers Corner and all those. These are not urban places. These are single subdivisions that have between 5,000 and 10,000 homes each. And we've got, last time I counted, 9 of them in the Charleston area. So where's the effort being directed in these growing places, which are not urban, to make sure they don't end up being just replicants of the problems we already have in the suburbs?
You bring up a great point of the 176 17A corridor, which is where Nexton, Carnes Crossroads, Cane Bay, Wildcat all are, which, if at total build out, will be large enough to house the population currently of the town of Mount Pleasant. Those communities don't interconnect with each other. Nexton and Carnes Crossroads, which are developed by 2 different developers and are in 2 different municipalities. This was an annexation string here where we have Nexton in Somerville and Carnes Crossroads in Goose Creek. Cane Bay and Wildcat are in unincorporated Berkeley County. They were all given, PUD, planned unit development zoning for each of their municipalities or local governments to allow them to build what they want, how they want, and they don't connect with each other, which means that right now, basically, those communities will rely on 2 major thoroughfares that can't support the traffic that's currently there, which will also drive commuters out to Volvo, which is just past there. We need to bring those local governments and those developers to the table to really redesign their communities in unity to each other so that you can interconnect them. You should be able to drive from 17A and College Park Road through Carnes Crossroads into Nexton, out to 176 to Cane Bay and up into the historic side of Monk's Corner. Without having to necessarily get onto those main thoroughfares, you should be able to use local roads for local trips and leave the highways for the longer commutes. Otherwise, we are going to end up with major congestion like we see on Johnny Dodds and Coleman and Savannah Highway. We have an opportunity before it gets going, but again, it takes that political will and the leadership to bring people to the table, because as long as the developers are just focusing on their 4 corners of their property, they are going to develop how they want, and we are not going to have a good quality of life in those areas. We're already experiencing it right now with people who are sitting in traffic at that intersection of 17A and 176.
So I think Jason brings up a good point, and I'm actually more of a land use planner than a transportation planner over the last few decades. But one of the things that has not occurred up until probably since we were coming out of the recession is that recognition that land use planning and transportation are so linked that when we're doing land use planning, or when jurisdictions are looking at the plans that the developers bring in, a really critical component of that is to have the transportation engineers for the counties or the jurisdictions to be looking at where those roads are and to have the foresight to know how those roads are all going to, and communities are going to connect to one another. And I've been working with Berkeley County for several years and worked on their comprehensive plan, and all those developments that were approved out there were identified as being in their growth area, but when they did those improvements or did those plans, nobody looked at how those are going to be connected. So as a result, Berkeley County now, with its transportation sales tax money, is having to go back and look at how to realign Nexton Parkway to connect straight across from Cane Bay Boulevard to kind of improve that connectivity. So by just, as land use planners, looking at how the transportation connections are made and making sure that our transportation departments are on the same board with us, that could make a huge difference. And unfortunately, up until 2010, a lot of jurisdictions really weren't looking at that. And I think Now we're starting to look at how we have to go back and retrofit, so how can we like not make that happen again? And I think both Dorchester County and Berkeley County, I know, and Charleston County's kind of been ahead of us on this, but those two communities, their new plans are looking more at how do we retrofit, how do we allow for more dense, more kind of transit-oriented development, how do we make sure that the transportation system is kind of one of the bases of our comprehensive plans for land use development.
Everyone, I think, generally agrees that being able to walk places or bike places, especially short trips around the house, like to get a gallon of milk or to get a hamburger or something, is part of the solution. If you can walk or bike, then that helps ease congestion. And yet, the Charleston metro area in South Carolina consistently rank as some of the most dangerous localities to walk and bike. And I think you see that with the fact that, with the exception of this wonderful bike pedaling right out our window on the Cooper River Bridge, the expenditures on sidewalks and safe bike lanes, a safe crossing over the Ashley River, have really lagged behind. And politically, you can see why. Everybody's been in a very much a roads mindset, and that's where a lot of the dollars have gone to roads. But I guess my question to the panel is, what's it going to take before this area makes a greater, I guess, financial commitment to try to make bike and pedestrian options more safe? Something that you would not only do perhaps yourself as a grown adult, but that you might feel comfortable with your middle schooler doing.
Well, I mean, that's the question we've been debating now for a long time, as you know. I mean, you went and rode your bike across the county. How long ago was it now that you got in your bike and rode across the county?
About 6
years. 6 or 7 years ago, and you see it all out there. I will tell you what it's going to take, and that is demand from a growing, vibrant community that wants to make sure that the people who live here, the people who work here, the people who they employ have access to their community in a number of different ways. And large-scale employers are demanding that we have multimodalism, and it just is going to have to take a commitment from all of us, from elected leaders to people in positions where they're looking at funding and planning, to planning departments and traffic and transportation departments, to say, look, we are not going to do any single-purpose roads anymore. We're not going to do single-purpose projects at all. We are going to integrate in every project that we have, in a planning project or a traffic and transportation project, multimodalism. So if you're walking 100 yards, 100 feet, biking a mile, or driving 10 miles, everything that you go by and see is connected, interconnected, and in the most important way, segregated and separated, right? Then you've got challenges. I mean, I live downtown Charleston. Downtown Charleston was gridded and designed long before cars existed. Bikes came along, so we have that added challenge. You've got lots of short runs, lots of walking, lots of biking, and a whole lot of cars. We just have to prioritize it. I will just tell you, from where I sit as an elected official on the local level, you hear a lot in the background noise about people want roads. They want people to have roads built. But we've got to look at roads. But I will tell you that when people go to the voting booth, they are voting for people who are committed to looking at alternate forms of transportation and putting in infrastructure for, among other things, bike pedestrian safety. I'm a perfect example. When I ran for city council 10 years ago, I ran on one issue, and that was getting across the Ashley River. We haven't done it 10 years later, but we've gotten a lot further than we will go, and I won in fairly large numbers. And that tells you something, that people have it on their mind. Now we just need to take that next step and actually make it happen, and it's one project at a time. And if there was ever a project in this region that will show our commitment to being multimodal and to thinking about ways to get around our community, it is bridging the Ashley River. It is connecting West Ashley to downtown. Every single person in a community should be able to walk, bike, or drive to their city hall. Right now, if you live in West Ashley, the only way to get to city hall to complain or to compliment, thank you very much, is to get in your car and drive. And that's just not the way cities, good, healthy, vibrant, long-living cities operate.
Well, the five of us could go on for quite some time, as you can see, just talking about these issues among ourselves, but of course part of the forum is to hear from you. And so I'm wondering if any of you have a sort of a question out there that you'd like to pose to one of the panelists.
Okay, a question about funding. I know the one set really worked well. I mean, it was advertised. I know there's some questions about 546 issue. But in terms of being so dependent on the legislature, which, you know, has its own issues, but in terms of saying, and Senator Grooms had the I guess it was a compromise, 2 cents for 3 years, relative to what our needs are statewide, because you keep talking about the infrastructure and what the state legislature allocates for these kind of things, for everything, and then you have to worry about the federal. But are there some thoughts about doing more local, I guess, ownership, whether the 1 center keep increasing that to a couple cents and revisiting the whole gas tax, or it's a user's tax, it's fair to everybody. I know it's roads centered, so to speak, but still, to get away from having the legislature dictating such a small amount of money that we know is minuscule compared to what it needs. And the other thing, just in general, is looking at the impact of the Ports Authority. I mean, I know they talked about barges now to help reduce what's going on in the Wando terminal, but then with the Leatherman coming on and seeing the crossovers on I-26, that's a huge percentage of the traffic here that contributes to gridlock and everything else. But I mean, that's a whole other issue unto itself, is to incorporating the Ports Authority into some overall plan. But the question of funding, more ownership locally, so we don't have to depend on outside things as much as we can. And what'll pass legislatively and from a citizen standpoint, but also the effect of the Ports Authority and their traffic volume. When you go, we all know it. To have those two things sort of looked at. That's two questions that I have.
Anybody want to tackle?
Well, I mean, the closer you can govern to home, the better off you are. The half-cent sales tax is an available pool of money where we can use for projects that are local and locally based. And
that is unique to Charleston.
And that is unique to Charleston, and that's something that you all did. I mean, the last half-cent sales tax, I think, passed 54 to 46. It was close. It was a little bit controversial for a number of different reasons. But that is now a local pot of money that we're not beholden at the state level to put in place for some infrastructure. Low Country Rapid Transit, 1/3 of the half-cent sales tax is going to go to transit-oriented development and projects. Low Country Rapid Transit will be born of that. So we have some resources here. Keep demanding local resources go to things like the improvements that you want, to multimodalism, recognizing that it's not just all about paving. We got to do some paving. We got to fix some roads. We got to build some things. But your roads are water storage facilities. We can use some of that money to improve that. I mean, a perfect example is the hospital district, right? It floods there. You can't get there on Calhoun Street, which is a road. So we have resources. It's how we spend them and how wisely we spend them. And I would suggest this: the more wisely we spend them, the more bang we get for our buck, the more we show that dealing with roads in many different ways, we will get then help both at the state and the federal level, because we can show them models that work. Lead from within, and from without will come at you.
And if I can jump in on that, I mean, part of the problem is just the scale of it. I mean, the half cent, if I remember right, just off the top of my head, I think it's supposed to raise
2.1
billion over 25 years.
Right.
Which, I mean, I know all the money for 526 isn't just coming from that pot, but that's basically the cost of 526, of widening the existing part and building a new part. I mean, adding a few lanes to 4 miles of Highway 41 in Mount Pleasant, $140 million. I mean, the scale, the cost of these projects, before you know it, $2.1 billion does not sound like a lot of money, and that's what the penny tax is supposed to have cent. It's supposed to raise over 25 years.
You could also go build a bridge across the Ashley for bike and pedestrian facilities for $20 million, which is, you know, interest for a week on that money. So there are scalable projects you could do. You could fly over 17 in Maine. You can get over Folly Road and fly over. There are projects. You can build pitchforks for $7 and $8 million at a time, which give real relief. If any of you have gone to Johns Island any time since they added that turn lane going out onto Johns Island, one turn lane has made a huge difference. That was not a $1 billion project. It seemed like it because it took forever. It was a $1 billion project, but it finally got done and it works. So there are projects out there. Get educated. There are things we need to do to actually build facilities for tires and for roads that can give you real relief without waiting. I mean, I was at a meeting last week where everybody agreed, regardless of what their political bent on it was, 526, the new version, is 10 to 13 years out. Well, what are we going to do for the next 10 to 13 years? Sit here and talk with you? Or are we going to do some other things that in the meantime will give us real relief? You got to integrate, and that's where we have to use our money, limited resources they may be, in a smart way to build multimodalism and give people relief close to their homes so they feel like we're doing something for them. That to me is the ultimate answer to all this. $7, $10, $20 million a time, not $1 billion at a time.
Right, and we want to take some more questions, but I've got a question I want to throw out to the audience. I mean, I'm just curious, how many of y'all work somewhere where they let you work a compressed work week or odd hours in order to avoid rush hour traffic? Some people, okay, well that's great. All right, because one of the things we keep hearing people talk about is part of the solution is just not everyone wanting to be on the road at exactly the same time, the same day. And I don't know if that's catching on or not, but I mean, when we talk about HOV lanes, that actually requires people to share cars, which, you know, people don't seem to do. I couldn't tell who had their hand up first. I'll just start from the right.
So you mentioned about a model that works. Is there a city or town in this country that we should be like?
So, you know, we never in the Charleston region want to say we're like anybody, and we're not, we're unique. I do think that we can learn lessons from a number of different places. Remembering too, I think, I want to give you a quick answer, because yes, there's an answer. We are very small geographically and very small in terms of population with huge needs. The city of Charleston, the population is only 135,000. The county's 350,000 plus or minus. We get 7.5 million visitors a year, so we have to build infrastructure for people who live here and people who visit here. So, I mean, for instance, Richmond has just really gone through a good retrofit program with their transit system that's worked in an old historic district, and we're actually working and looking with them. The other place I would say is public-private partnerships work in transit. Tampa is a city that is going to build what we call low country rapid transit, BRT, through public-private partnershiping. So those two cities that historically hadn't had successes, that are now having successes, are places that we can learn a lot from, I think, for sure.
I would also throw out, just to be provocative, New York, in the sense that if you look at historically, New York and Charleston were very similar urbanistically. Of course, New York went crazy, they won the war, and we all know that, you know, that. But New York has got, and it is one of the poster children, along with Washington, D.C. and some others, of ways where there are just many ways to get around. Of course, very pedestrian friendly, you know, wide sidewalks, very walkable. They're doing what they can to promote bike use, but also a great bus system. They've got subways. That's probably not feasible here, but the subways are really what allows New York to be tall. They've also got a very robust ferry system and other things. So in other words, they've got a lot of different ways to get around. And as a result, even though they're the largest metro area in the country, I think that the Texas A&M research study pointed them, the last number I remember is that in terms of congestion in their metro area, they only ranked 44th.
And just footnote one, their Metro Regional Transportation Authority's budget is $6 billion a year. What's CARTA's budget, Daniel? 29. All right, 25 million. So we got some scalability issues, but we're heading in the right direction. So budget's help.
Next question, yes.
If people want to use the public system, buses, here we can't have subways because it's so low, but there need to be convenient pickup spots for people to go, because a bus isn't going to come by each individual house, like a school bus or something. But somewhere near areas like this, they need to decide how could we have, starting, the 10 most valuable pickup points in this Charleston area, and then there need to be parking garages there so they can drive to the pickup spot. But in Northern Virginia, they made the mistake each time. They never give enough parking. And people go to use a pickup spot. They want to go into Washington, D.C. and different places, and they drive around. They can't find a parking spot, and after a while, they do what they shouldn't do. They park, and they get a big ticket. Or they get a lug on their car, or the car get towed. So in Charleston, we could decide on how many pickup points would be feasible to start with, and the most used one, and build a parking garage there. Yes, we take parking garage, they get on the bus, and they take them to downtown, the medical center, where the hotel the medical people work, and the hotels need worker places to go. And you can pick all these people and disperse them, then they can walk.
There have been some developments along.
Yes, we just cut the ribbon on the first car-to-own park and ride up in North Charleston that holds 189 cars. It was running full the other day. The Hop, which is now operating downtown Charleston, which you can park for $5 and ride all day long. It's 21 hours a day. We're averaging about 500 workers, so we're taking 400 or 500 cars off the road. So park and ride is part and parcel of our long-term strategy. I see Sharon Hollis in the back. She's a planner. She knows where we run people from and to. So we're very much focused on the park and ride concept.
More than one
here.
parking lot.
Oh yeah,
That's
sure.
where the pickup points are.
Low Country Rapid Transit will be a park and ride driven facility, transit facility, and a development facility. So,
Before we take our next question, can everybody hear the questions, or should I repeat them? Okay, good.
As far as cars concerned, why such big buses when you don't have hardly anybody on them? As a lot of people talk about, why not smaller buses and more of them?
so the question, and it's a good one. They're all good questions. Is why with CARTA do you see big buses and not smaller buses? There are some reasons for that. Quick history lesson: when I took over at CARTA, we ran the oldest fleet of buses in the United States. Our young buses were from the 1996 Olympics. We had 5 of them with over 1 million miles on them. We, because like every other transit system in America, except federal funding, we are limited on where we can buy our buses from. There are only a certain number of manufacturers in this country that manufacture only a certain level, size, and type of bus. So we are working with them, and so are others, to try to get more options. We just can't go to Austria, we can't go to Germany, we can't go pluck from them some of those really cool buses that you see when you go over there. But we are working on it, and we would like to scale back. We're about to get, by the way, 3 of our first 5 ever electric buses are coming to a CARTA system near you sooner rather than later. So we're making some progress. We're very conscious of that, and we're going to have to work with the system that we've got in place currently and try to convince manufacturers that systems like us need smaller facilities.
All right, yes.
It seems to me, I'm a cyclist, so my interest is in the complete streets and being able to actually get somewhere on my bicycle. And we've got a panel of people who, from my perspective, appear to support what I want to do. And yet whenever...
We do.
Yes, exactly. I've actually ridden with Councilman Seekings across the bridge to the between West Ashley and downtown. Every time an initiative comes up, I've heard almost every one of you say, everybody agrees. When it's brought to everybody agrees that this needs to happen. And yet it doesn't happen, and I'm wondering, is it because there is a small group of very powerful people who are blocking it? Or is it funding? Or is it actually that not everybody agrees that all should have access to the roads? What stops things like the lane switch?
Yep.
I mean, that's our most prominent recent example. Why is it not happening?
So looking at the bridge, the Ash River Bridge, and that goes back to your political leadership. Charleston County was in charge of the funding to do that conversion. Even though it's a City of Charleston initiative, Charleston County controls the funding for those types of local projects, and Charleston County elected officials, those council members, were the ones that took funding away from that. It really was a small, powerful group of people. It's the same elected officials that just a couple weeks ago tried to take funding away from improvements to St. Andrews Boulevard to provide a safer crossing of the West Ashley Greenway across there. That was part of a very well-engaged, community-driven design process to improve, led by the Charleston Parks Conservancy, to improve the Greenway and the Bikeway in West Ashley. There are elected officials that are still of the mindset that priority should be over drivers, single occupancy vehicles, than multimodalism, and it really comes back to the ballot box. If you have concerns over how your dollars are being spent and the type of infrastructure that you want to see, you need to pay attention to what the elected officials in this region are doing and not doing, and vote with that in mind. A couple years ago, a year ago maybe, Town of Mount Pleasant Council tried taking funding away from the Coleman Boulevard improvement plans that would have provided a bike lane on it. They wanted to get rid of that median because some people didn't like having to do a U-turn. They wanted to be able to use the suicide lane in the middle whenever they wanted. It was a very close vote. As you know, that project is still moving forward, but that could have completely destroyed any opportunity to make that a complete street. We are beholden to where the funding is, and for the Ashley River Bridge, in this instance, that is Charleston County. Charleston County took that money away, and that Charleston County took money away from the Pitchfork project on Johns Island. Charleston County would prefer to just widen roads. They would prefer to put money towards 526. The half-cent sales tax funded $2.1 billion worth of roads. There was a list of projects that were vetted and identified that totaled $2.1 billion. So where are we going to get $300 million for 526 from that list? Something's going to have to be taken away from there. That is, again, comes back to political will. And the only way to change that is by voting.
And so they don't
by
all
reading the
agree.
newspaper.
And by reading the newspaper.
Not everybody agrees with it.
Well, also, I think what we see is so many times when we do the road plans, and come to mind of Clements Ferry and 176 and the Glen McConnell. So they look at the plans to do the improvements, and a bike lane or multi-use path is included in that. And then when they go to look at whether they have to purchase additional right-of-way and what the overall cost is, the first thing that goes is the bike lane or the multi-use path. And a lot of times then they come back to us because we do have a separate pot of money, a whopping $880,000 a year that we get for transportation alternatives, which are bike paths and sidewalk type projects, and come back to us to basically try to fund those improvements to put those in. So I think we have made headway, at least in the last 20 years, with when we do plan the roads, to plan those facilities to be a part of it, and to push our complete streets policies. But again, when you start cutting off the top, that's usually the first thing to go. So I think it is the will of people talking and pushing that that's not our options, that we shouldn't be eliminating those things, because those are also ways to help relieve the congestion.
And I'm just reminded, as you sit here and just look over either your right or left shoulder, the most iconic, most successful, most expensive public transit project that has been built in this region is right there. It's the bridge. And that bridge has on it wide lanes for cars. It also has the best linear park, 2.2 mile linear park in this region. That's that bike pedestrian lane. It was minutes from being written out of that project, but it's in. So to the extent that you in the public are interested in multimodalism and seeing projects that have access for lots of different things, not just for cars, point to that project. No one is going to tell you that project should have been built. It's fantastic. It has access for everybody. And that's the way we need to be thinking about things, even large-scale projects. It's okay. There are going to be real roads built in this region. We're going to repave things. We're going to do all that. But when we do it, let's go back and think about the success of that project right there, and the amount of money, public money that was invested, and the result that we got from it, which, among other things, was access for everybody. And that, in the end, is, I think, the lesson learned that we just cannot forget. And we've got, the best exhibit in the world sitting right there.
That bridge was built below cost.
And ahead of schedule.
And ahead of schedule.
As we wrap up, and like I said, we could go on, but I want to wrap up. But I want to ask sort of one last provocative question that maybe will put what we've been talking about, this congestion issue, in a bit of perspective. And it's something I've been personally thinking about. But the question really is this. Isn't congestion good? Isn't it a sign of a vital city? Isn't it something that towns all over Ohio would die for?
So it's a great question, and there are two types of congestion. I don't want to get too picky on you. Good congestion and bad congestion, right? Good congestion is congestion that's predictable. You know where it's coming, you know where it's going to, and it's congestion that is created of a vibrant community where there are options. That's good congestion. That also tells you you've got some more things to do. If there's nothing and nobody on the road, that's bad. I remember seeing my law partner, Jeff Leith, over there when we had the economic meltdown. We drove across the bridge. There were no cars on the bridge. no containers in the port, no ships. It was really spooky, right? You want activity, you want things moving around you, but ultimately it's got to move. So yes, congestion, people, activity, good. But if it's a broken system where you're hopelessly in it all the time and predictably the same way, then it's broken.
Everyone agree?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at pictures of every great city, including the city of Charleston, as from the time that photography was created, and there's congestion. It's no longer horses, buggies, and people, but every city has congestion if it's thriving, but it does come down to equity and options and being able to choose what type of mobility that it will work for you. And part of it is, as humans, we do need to interact with each other. We can't be in our own little pods. That's where the breakdown of society comes in.
And I'll just add that the land use and the redevelopment are kind of a real critical component. I have a sister who lives in Washington, D.C. and works out of Detroit. So her commute is on an airplane once every couple of weeks, and she lands in Detroit, and she said it is such a vast wasteland. They're going through that. So without that vibrant economy and without land use planning for the communities to be that way, even with the multimodalism, you're not filling it. So I think our problem in terms of us being so successful at our economic development and in the last 20, 25 years is not a bad problem. We just need to basically make sure that we've got the options to address some of the issues that have come about as a result of it.
I know it's time to wrap up now, so I want to turn it over to Chris. We will be around a little. I see a few hands still. We will try to stick around just a little to answer questions one-on-one later. But thank you all.
Thank you so much for our panelists and David and Robert. One of the things that I'm glad Robert mentioned about subscribing to the paper, reading the newspaper, because we tackle topics that are complex and try to break them down into understandable information for people to know what they can do to take action to make differences for themselves or for their businesses. It's also another reason why we decided to have Inside Business Live. I sit here today, I've learned something at every single event because these are very complex issues. So thank you for coming today and sharing your thoughts and your questions and being invested in the community. We encourage you to offer ideas of what you would like to see at these events. A lot of times what we do is we look at what we write about and what are triggering questions and responses from people and how we shape the panel. So our next Inside Business Live is going to be in October. So look out for that, and we encourage you to sign up for our business newsletter. And again, thank you so much for being here, and enjoy the rest of your work week.
Yeah.